In this video, I just wanted to go into a little more detail on how to use the command line in Linux, or bash commands. The last version of this didn't have as many commands, and I just wanted to make sure that we addressed as much as possible. On top of that, I wanted to clear up a few things since there seems to be a little bit of confusion. I'm on a Linux computer right now, specifically a virtual machine that I've created, and all that means is that it's a computer on my computer. My computer is running Windows, but this is a Linux computer that I have on top of that computer. Now, whenever you do SSH is a way to log into computers that you're not currently at. Whenever you do SSH, whether it be via PuTTY or via a terminal, then you are logging into another computer. So if you SSH into the Sally server, all you're doing is logging into a Linux computer exactly like the one I'm using right now. If you were to physically walk into UNLV right now and sit down in the computer lab and sit down at a computer and type in your username and your password, you would also be logging into the same Linux computer that you're also logging into when you do SSH. As far as doing all of these commands, you can do them if you're on a Linux computer. If you're SSH'd into a Linux computer, like if you're SSH'd into Sally, all of these commands will work. Or if you're on Mac, these will also work right out of the box if you open up your terminal application, which comes with your computer. If you want to run this on Windows, you're going to either need to SSH into a Linux computer, or you're going to need to install WSL, which is a Windows subsystem of Linux. It essentially allows you to run Linux commands on Windows in your command line or via PowerShell. In order to enable that, it's in Windows 10. All you have to do is go to the settings and tick it on, and it will install it for you. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let's get started with the actual commands. What we're going to use here is a command language called bash, and bash is basically just a way for us to talk with a computer only via commands, which are things that we type in. Here you'll see that I've already opened a terminal on this Linux computer, and so something to keep in mind is that not all of the commands that I do here will be able to work on a computer like Sally, because you won't necessarily have permissions to do all of them. That being said, I think all of those commands I'm going to wait until the end to do, and I'll mention when we get to them. For the time being, let's just go over a few basic Linux commands, and we'll see what they do. Whenever I open a terminal or SSH into a computer, it will always put me in my home directory. Here I've opened up a file browser so we can see what's happening in the file browser as well as while we do things in the terminal. When I log in, it will put me in my home directory, which is where I am in this file browser. If I want to see these directories, so we have these folders here, if I want to see them, all I have to do is type ls. And you'll see that I get exactly the same thing here. I get the desktop, documents, downloads, all of that stuff. So it will show me all of the directories that are in the current directory if I type ls, which stands for list. If you do this on SSH, you might not get the same colors I do. Here it shows blue whenever it's a directory and white whenever it's a file, I believe. But it will be maybe just white if you SSH. That's okay. Just consider that there are some directories and some things that are files, and we can go into directories, but we can't go into files because they're just files. Now let's say I want to go into the documents directory. Basically the equivalent of me double-clicking on the documents folder if I was using a GUI interface. I can do that using cd, which stands for change directory. If I simply type in cd documents, then I will end up in the documents directory. If I type ls now, you'll see that I get nothing, which makes sense because if I look at the documents on this file browser that I have open, you'll see that it's completely empty. Let's go ahead and try to add an actual file now. There are a bunch of different ways that you can do this, but the way that I'm going to do this is using the touch command. So I'm simply going to take the name touch and then give the name of the file that I want to create. Here I'll create something called example.txt, and it will close. If I want to actually be able to edit this now, or at least make sure that it exists, I can type in ls, and you'll see that example.txt does in fact exist in this directory where I just created it. If I do this in the file browser, you'll see that we also have something called example.txt. So just consider, you're not going to be able to see this file browser when you're SSH'd into a computer because you only have access to the terminal. This is just here for a visual aid. Okay, let's say we want to actually be able to edit the file. We can do that with any sort of text editor. There are a bunch built into Linux. Some of them include Emacs, Vim, Atom, and personally I like to use Nano. In order to use any of these, all you have to do is type the name of the program. Here, my name of my text editor is called Nano, and then followed by the file that you want to open. Here, that's called example.txt. I'll simply hit enter, and it will open the file. Now, this file is empty because I just created it without putting anything into it, but you might have a file that actually has stuff inside of it. So let's just type some words in here. I'll type maybe hello world, and if I want to save using specifically Nano, all I have to do is either do Ctrl-O, so you'll see here we have all these carets and then letters. These just stand for control. Control is the caret, and then whatever letter on the keyboard. So Ctrl-O would write. I simply have to hit enter, and it should write. Another way to do this is if, let's just say I change the file by putting an exclamation point here. If I go to exit, which is Ctrl-X, it will ask me if I want to save the modified buffer. If I hit yes and then enter, it will also save it as I exit. Now let's say I want to see the contents of that file without actually opening it in a text editor to do any sort of editing. The way I can do that straight from the terminal is simply typing cat, and then I will do cat example.txt. Cat stands for concatenate, and it will concatenate the contents of the file to the current text that's in the terminal or the buffer. And you'll see that here we have hello world, which is exactly what I entered inside that file. So it just displays the contents of a file. Now let's say I want to know what current directory I'm in. It does kind of tell me here on the left, but if I ever want to know, I can simply type in pwd, and this will tell me the present working directory is what it stands for. If I type that in, you'll see that it says /home, my username, and then documents, which is where I'm currently at as far as the path goes in that file explorer. Let's say I want to get out of this directory. I can simply do it using cd, and then ... stands for the directory above ours. And if I do that, you'll see that we're back where we started, which is the directory above documents, my home directory. Really quick, let's change directory back into documents and do a few more examples here. First things first, let's say I want to be able to move the file that we have and be able to move it from the documents to my actual home directory. Now, normally, if you were in something like this file browser with the graphical user interface, you could simply cut it and then drag and drop it back to home. But if we're doing this via command line, we're going to need to type it out. Here, if we see the example.txt, I'll first do an example of copying it. In order to copy a file, it's cp, which stands for copy, and then it's the source file and then the destination location. Here, my source is the example.txt. This is the file that I'm copying. And then where I want to copy it to is the directory above this one. ... stands for above, and then / in order to specify that we want it in the directory. And I'll simply name this example2.txt. If I wanted to make a copy of it here in this exact directory, I could simply do example.txt, and then maybe example copy.txt. And if we wanted to immediately see that, you'll see I have two copies of the same file. And just to check the earlier example, if I change directory upwards and ls, you'll see that I do have a file called example2.txt, so I've made two copies of this file. Let's change directory back into the documents to do one more thing here. We have two text files. Let's say I want to move it without copying it. I can simply do that with mv. So perhaps I want to move example copy to the directory above this one. I could do that with move example copy.txt and then type example copy.txt and put two dots in front of it. Now you'll see it's no longer in this directory, and if I go upwards, it is now there in the root directory that we were in before. There's one last thing that you can use mv for, and it's renaming files. You can simply move a file from its own directory to the same directory it's in order to change its name. So here, if I wanted to rename the example.txt file that we have, I could simply type in mv example.txt and then whatever I want to rename it to. So we'll say example renamed.txt, which I misspelled, but that's okay. You'll see that it is what I just typed. So that about covers how we can interact with files. Let's move around a little bit more and try to do some stuff. If I type cd and then slash, this is another way to change directory relative to your home. So if I do this, this will change me to the root of my computer. On Linux, it will have a bunch of directories like this. You can't necessarily interact with all of these if you are using Sally because you don't have permissions, but I should be able to go to home. Home is where we just were, and I can change directory to my user, and we are back where we started. So slash is a way to designate the root of your computer. Think of it like the very base level of whatever drive you're currently on. We've been using the ls command to list some things, and we can actually use it to list different things if we use it in different ways. First off, we can use it to list the contents of a directory we're currently not in. Currently I'm in my home directory, which has this directory called documents that we were just in. I can simply do ls documents to show the contents of that directory. So here we see that we have that text file that we just saw was in the documents directory. I can also use it to get some metadata on the documents that exist. So if I type in ls and then /l, if we use a dash in front of something, that means it's what's called a flag. It basically just modifies the way that we use a command, and this goes for your compiler as well as commands in bash. So we can have them do specific things or use specific options or settings if we use these flags. The L flag here should allow us to see the metadata of all the directories and files. Here you'll see that this is the same list of files that we had up here with the same directories, but now it contains more information. This has to do with whether you're able to read or write it and who's able to read or write it. And these have to do with the owner, I believe. And this is likely how many bytes it is. Last, we have probably the most important and the most readable here, which is the date that it was created. You'll see that all of these were created on June 8th, with the exception of the directories. They were all created on June 6th, which I believe is when I started this virtual machine, and June 8th is today. These will tell you specifically the last time that you updated these files. Now, that can be important because you may want to overwrite files if you have a newer one, and that comes into play when you're doing things like compilation or copying files. If I wanted to update the information about these, I can simply use the touch command that we used earlier. I used that earlier in order to create a file, but you can also use it for its intended purpose, which is to touch a file, basically open and then close it so that its time in the metadata gets updated. Here, let's just say I want to update example2.txt. I last updated this at 1420. Right now, if you look at the top on the clock there, it's 1426. So if I was to simply type touch example2.txt and then re-look at the metadata, in order to do this, I'm going to simply hit up on the arrow keys on my keyboard. Doing that will scroll through all of the commands that I've previously entered, and it's kind of just convenient if you need to retype something, or if you maybe made a mistake and you just need to fix something. So I'll simply hit the arrow keys to scroll back to this one that we previously typed. I will hit enter, and you'll see that now example2.txt, its last open date was 1426. Now don't worry about changing this if you simply open a file and don't close it and then modify nothing. It won't update this. It will only do it if you actually change something within the file or if you do touch like I did earlier. Okay, my terminal is now a little bit cluttered. We have a lot of text on the screen. Let's say I want to get rid of that. I simply have to type in clear, and that will clear out my whole terminal. So all of the text is gone now. All the things I did are still there, but now it's just nicer to read. So far we've gone over how to create a file, how to move a file, how to rename a file. Let's go over how to delete a file and how to delete a directory. Currently we still have a file called example2.txt here. Let's say I want to delete it. All I have to do is simply type in rm example2.txt and it will delete it. Now if I ls again, it's gone. If I want to remove a directory, I can simply do that by typing in rmdir and then the name of the directory. And the directory does have to be completely empty in order for this to work. So if I was to try to remove documents right now, let's just say, then it will tell me that it can't do it because it's not empty. And that's because if we looked at the inside of documents, if you remember from earlier, we had a file called example renamed in there. If I want to delete that, I can simply remove it from the documents folder. A shortcut for deleting all of the files in something is using the star or the wildcard. What this means is it will do everything that matches before that. So here, if I wanted to delete all files, I could simply do rm documents star. Be very careful because if you remove and then put a star, you will delete all of your files. So be very, very careful and be 100% sure that this is what you want to do. Here, it's not a big deal because it's just a random text file. But if you're on a computer with important things, please make sure that you're very careful about using star because it means everything. I can also use it before file extensions if I want to. So here, if I wanted to, let's just say, delete all of the text files within that directory, I could simply do rm documents/star.txt. To see that in action, let's first go into the documents, cd documents, and here let's just create a file called hello.txt, and then we'll create another one called example.jpg. I'll go back up. Actually, let's delete it from here. That's okay. So if I was to type in rm star, it would delete all of my files. Let's ls just to see what everything is. You see that we have 2 text files and a JPEG. If I was to type in rm star, it would delete all 3 of these files. But if I type in rm star.txt, it will fill in that star with everything that matches that has a .txt after it. So star being a wildcard means that anything could get filled in there. Here, if I finish this, you'll see if I ls again, it's deleted only my text files but not my JPEGs. So that's preserved because I only hit rm star.txt. One other convenient thing to know for the bash terminal, aside from the up arrows which allow you to see commands that you previously entered, and down which allows you to also navigate that, you can also use tab to autofill things for you. So let's say I wanted to open this file. If I simply type cat and then E, which is the first letter of example.jpg, and hit tab, it will autofill the rest of it for me. This is nice if you have really long file names, or if you're trying to change through a bunch of directories, you can simply use that to make things easier. And if there are things that share the same amount of letters that you've entered so far, it will show you all of the things that match with that. Let's say you forget some of these commands, which is totally understandable. It's not easy to remember all of this all at once. You can always check what kind of commands there are or what a command does by using the man command, which stands for manual. If I typed manual ls, you'll see it gives me quite a long manual page on all of these flags that come with ls. Here you'll see that it says ls and then option, and then optionally a file. So this means the directory, which we said earlier, if I typed in something like ls documents, it would show me all of the files that are in documents, and we use something like lsl, which should be somewhere around here, to be able to use a long listing format which had all of the metadata for the files. Now you can do all of this if you wanted to. It's quite a lot of options that we have here. If you ever want to see all of these in the Linux manual, simply type man and then the command. Now if I want to exit a program, I could type Q here, it's telling me to quit that way. I can also do it with Ctrl-Z. Now Ctrl-Z is a little bit different when it quits. Q is the way you're intended to quit this program, but if I hit Ctrl-Z, it will kill it. And what that does is it will just completely stop the program and just halt it there as is. If you're used to Windows, this is kind of like pulling open Task Manager and hitting End Task. You're killing it in a not very elegant way, not like hitting the X in the corner of the window. I mention this because if you're running a program that generates an infinite loop on your computer, you can simply hit Ctrl-Z to kill your program if you think it's never going to stop, which sometimes happens, especially when you're starting out in programming. You can definitely make that mistake. I know I have. Ctrl-Z is nice. You can kill a program that way. The last command I should probably mention is how to make a directory. The way we can do that is simply with mkdir. That will make a directory, and then you give the name of the directory. So here, let's just say I call it test. You'll see if I ls, I still have the example.jpg that I had, but I also have a blue one here that's called test, which is a directory. If I want to go into that again, I can just use cd to go into it. Now that about does it for all of the commands that you'll need to use for this class, or that are just good to have in general. I want to go into a few more commands, specifically 2 more commands that you will be able to use if you use Linux a lot, which you probably will if you're a computer science major, so I suggest sticking around and checking these out. The first one is called apt-get. This is a package manager, and so when you install something on Windows, or maybe even Mac, you would simply go to the website, click download, and you would get some sort of exe or MSI, some sort of installer for your computer. It opens up a wizard, and you just click next a bunch, and you select a directory to install at, and it puts in the program files or something like that. On Linux, we don't necessarily have that liberty. We have to do it via the command line. And so the package manager that most people use is apt, or I'm going to use apt-get here. There are a few other ones, but for the time being, let's just focus on this one. Now let's say I want to install a program. Here I'm going to install something called Python, which is another programming language aside from C++ that I want. So I'm simply going to type apt-get install, and then I want the name of the program that I want to install. Here it should be called Python 3 is the one I want. And it says that it's locked, which is okay. That's kind of what I expected. And it says, are you root? What root means is that you are the admin user on your computer. So you're the person that has the most amount of privileges on the computer. In order to do that, we'd simply type sudo. Sudo stands for super user do. So on a Linux computer, a super user is essentially the equivalent to an admin on a Windows computer. It's the person that has the most amount of privileges and can do pretty much anything when it comes to installing or moving around files or executing things. If I do this now, it should prompt me for a password, which I will type in. And now it should install fine, unless I made a mistake. So I realize it says another program is currently using the apt-get install, so I think Ubuntu might be currently installing some stuff, which is probably why I got an error message earlier. It makes a bit of sense because I did just finish installing this virtual machine the other day and I haven't used it since, but assuming you have Ubuntu already updated all the way, or you're doing this on a server, you shouldn't get this error that I'm getting right now. It would actually install it, you'd have to sit there and wait, and it would take a while. And that's probably best if we don't do that for this video anyways. So that about does it for all the Linux commands that I wanted to go over. I think this is a more comprehensive version and it explains everything in a lot more detail. So hopefully that's helpful, and in some of the future videos we'll actually go into programming.